What I'd like to explore next is a message that I feel as though I've been getting from NHS England, that the mandatory elements, the gaps that we identify in someone's revalidation portfolio, aren't supposed to be in the PDP any longer.
Correct. There are mandatory expectations, and think about things like your patient questionnaire, like your multi-source feedback. They are something that you have to do to maintain your licence. There's an absolute must. They are, as you so rightly point out, mandatory. To a certain extent, so are an increasing number of other elements within medical practice. So your CPR updates, effectively your safeguarding updates. Mandatory training that if you talk to any of your hospital colleagues that they will have to go through on an annual basis will be coming into our system to a greater extent. They are not a massive issue, but they are not something that should be on your PDP because it's a given. They must be done. They must be done within the 5-year cycle. If you don't have them done, you won't maintain your licence. It will be revoked. So therefore, it's not something that should be in the PDP because that's not personal development. That is just maintenance of your licence. It is very, very basic.
But I feel really uncomfortable with that because I think the PDP is a great way to capture, particularly for those doctors who don't recognise the importance of the mandatory elements, like fire and manual handling perhaps, or who don't quite know how to get their head round doing their colleague feedback. And actually having discussed it in the appraisal can help them go a long way towards working out how to fill that gap, what they need to do, writing down the exact steps of how they're going to do it. And it's a baton that you pass on to the next appraiser so that next year they know the person really was given all the right advice and support about how to achieve that. Therefore, there's no excuses if they haven't.
I don't have an issue with the fact that you discussed it, that you've had those advice-giving sessions with the doctor to say how you can go about this, what you should be doing about it, that it's included in the write-up at the end so that the baton's handed over. And the individual doctor, after all, has the personal responsibility to maintain a record of whether they have actually completed those mandatory requirements. So I'm not suggesting don't have the discussion, I'm not suggesting don't have the advice giving, and I'm not suggesting don't maintain a record of it. It is not an element of the PDP. It is mandatory. If you don't do it, you will lose your licence.
How do you feel about being told you can't put the getting colleague feedback about part of your scope of work and planning that into your PDP anymore?
I think for a lot of doctors who are perhaps coming up to revalidation and don't have any particular burning issues that they want to discuss in the appraisal regarding their relationships with colleagues, their colleague feedback exercise is a mandatory part of their revalidation, and that is all that it is, in a sense, for them. For other doctors, I think there can be issues raised in the discussion which point very clearly to specific things that do need to be reflected on very carefully, that do need to be discussed, and perhaps that a colleague feedback exercise is not just a mandatory part of revalidation, that is actually a very important part of that doctor's personal development. And I think that it's difficult to say it's either one thing or the other for some doctors in some circumstances. So whilst I take the point that it almost seems silly to list things that we'd expect all doctors to be doing anyway as PDPs, because then they're not personal. For some doctors, those things may well be personal. So I would be reluctant to say it could never go in there.
Can it never go in there?
If it's the single mandatory one that you require for revalidation, then it should not be in a PDP. However, as Steph said, if there's particular relevance to an individual doctor in relation to some element of their practice, it's not a matter of saying, I'll do the multi-source feedback, tick box against my revalidation. It's a matter of saying I'm getting some reflections on negative feedback from somebody and how am I going to address that and have insight into it. And that may well actually be your second MSF in the cycle of 5 years. And certainly we've come across a number of doctors who have had multi-source feedback, discovered there was actually some negative element within that and decided to make changes, demonstrating enormous insight, full reflection on what they're doing, and had a second multi-source feedback within that cycle because they wanted to demonstrate that they have changed and that has an appropriate impact on their colleague relationships. I must admit, in all the cases we've seen, successfully so far. So that is probably inevitable, bearing in mind the insight you require to do that. So that would be perfectly reasonable to have in your PDP, but not just putting down, I'm going to do an MSF. There's a legitimacy behind doing it. And it goes back to the same element we were talking about earlier, how you write up the PDP rather than just, I haven't done, I need to do, I'll tick the box.
Even so, still pushing back one more time, if I've got other PDP objectives that are personal, developmental, arise from this stage of the revalidation cycle and are written to demonstrate impact on patient care, would it really be wrong to use my PDP to capture, I'm going to fill this gap by, I'm going to fill that gap by, and these are the other things I'm going to do that are personal to me?
I'm not going to give you a negative response to having it listed on your PDP. If that becomes an add-on for your reminder, fine, if that's what you want to do. It's not what I would expect to see at the top.